Give me liberty or give me death. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Ask not what your country can do for you.
7 years ago,
America was built on courage, on imagination. The American flag is the most recognized symbol of freedom and democracy in the world.
Small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
At Spartan Forge, we believe that we're born out of the story that we're about to tell you. Out of the lives of farmers, workers, soldiers, mothers, and fathers who carried the weight of freedom on their shoulders and built a republic unlike the world had ever seen. America did not become great because history guaranteed it. It became great because ordinary citizens accepted extraordinary responsibility. We built this series for people who still believe in these virtues: duty, courage, sacrifice, competence, faith, and a belief that a person should leave their family and community stronger than they found it. Because the American experiment has never rested solely on government politics. It has always rested on the character of the American people. This series is not nostalgia, it's a reminder that freedom survives only when the generation proves itself worthy of inheriting it. That the future of this republic will not be decided by outrage, division, partisan politics, but by whether or not Americans are willing to demand more of themselves. Stronger fathers, stronger mothers, better citizens, more capable neighbors, freer people. If even one person watches this series with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper respect for virtue, and a stronger desire to forge a worthy path for themselves and their families, then for me, this is all worth it. That is how America became great, and that's how America will remain great. Happy 250th, America. Let's build.
It is required and expected that exact discipline be observed and due subordination prevail through the whole army, as a failure in these most essential points must necessarily produce extreme hazard, disorder, and confusion, and end in shameful disappointment and disgrace.
It's important to understand at this time in American history, there was no standing army, and I want to start there because that is a fact that most people simply walk past when they talk about the birth of the American military. And it is perhaps the most important fact of all. When the British regulars fired on colonial militiamen at Lexington and Concord on the morning of April 19, 1775, the 13 colonies had no united fighting force. What they had were local militias, ordinary men, mostly farmers and tradesmen, organized at the town and county level, answerable only to the colony's provincial congress, and armed with whatever they had brought from home. Some were good shots, some were not. Some were disciplined, most were not. Now, the militia wasn't a contemptible force. At Lexington and Concord, citizen soldiers did something remarkable. They forced the world's most professional army to retreat from Concord back to Boston, bloodied and shaken. But everyone who understands warfare, and I mean really understands warfare, knew that this was not a force capable of winning a prolonged conflict against the full weight of the British Empire. Washington would write plainly, to place any dependence on the militia is assuredly resting on a broken staff. You see, Washington was a man who had spent his formative years studying terrain, surveying land, and watching armies move, and surviving the brutal onslaughts of the French and Indian War. There he learned, at considerable personal cost, that there is a difference between courage and capability. Courage you cannot teach quickly. Capability takes time, structure, and a standard that every man in the rank understands. And if you want to understand what raw, unstructured courage looked like in those first weeks, what it will cost, and what it could not yet accomplish, I want to tell you about a man whose name most Americans no longer recognize, and who, in my own estimation, belongs in a very short list of indispensable founders. His name was Joseph Warren. Warren was a Boston physician, Harvard-trained, 34 years old. He was the one who, on the night of April 18, 1775, dispatched Paul Revere and William Dawes on their midnight ride. He was the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. He was the chairman of the Committee of Safety. And on June 14, 1775, the same day that Congress voted to enact the Army into existence, he was commissioned a Major General. 3 days later, on June 17th, the British moved on the Patriot earthworks at Breeze Hill. What I want you to understand here was that Warren was a general. He had every right in every conventional military sense to stay back and just command, but he chose not to. He arrived at the redoubt, the position that they had built, found Colonel William Prescott in charge, and refused his commission on the spot. He said in effect, "I came here to volunteer. Tell me where I can be most useful." Prescott pointed to the redoubt itself, the most exposed, most dangerous position on the field, and Warren went to that position. A few weeks before, he had told a friend something that has haunted me ever since I first read it. He said, "These fellows say we won't fight. By heaven, I hope I shall die up to my knees in blood." And he got his wish. He held the redoubt through 2 failed British assaults. When the Patriots ran out of powder on the 3rd assault, Warren lingered to cover the retreat. A British officer recognized him, and he was shot through the head and killed instantly. The British knew exactly who he was. They stripped his body, mutilated it, and threw him in a shallow grave with another Patriot. And that's what they thought of Joseph Warren. And here is the part that to me is almost unbearable in its tenderness. 9 months later, after British evacuated Boston, his brothers and Paul Revere went to that grave to find him. The body had decomposed beyond visual recognition, but Revere was not just a silversmith, he was also by trade an early dentist. And shortly before the war, Revere had fashioned for his friend a small dental prosthetic, an ivory tooth, fastened in place with a silver wire. Revere knelt by the remains, looked into the mouth, and saw his own wire. He recognized his handiwork. That is how Joseph Warren came home. Historians call it the first recorded instance of forensic dental identification in American history. And it was performed by one founding father on the body of another, in an unmarked grave outside of Boston. I bring Warren up here at the beginning for a specific reason. Warren is what courage looks like without an army. He was unstructured, ungoverned, magnificent in his bravery, and fought at the very highest pitch. Multiply Warren by 1,000, and you don't get a republic. You get a generation of magnificent corpses and a cause that dies with them. That is the problem Congress had just voted 3 days earlier to try to solve. On June 14, 1775, the Second Continental Congress voted to establish the Continental Army. They absorbed the Patriot forces already besieging Boston, roughly 22,000 troops, and authorized the raising of 10 new companies of Continental riflemen drawn from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. June 14th is the date celebrated as the U.S. Army's birthday. The following day, Congress named a new commander. John Adams saw the strategic logic clearly. To bind the southern colonies to the revolutionary cause, the commander had to come from the South. In other words, the war had to be nationalized before it was even a nation. Adams described his candidate as a gentleman whose skill, experience as an officer, whose independent fortune, great talents, and excellent universal character would command the approbation of America. Connecticut delegate Eliphalet Dyer captured something equally important. This man was no harum-starum, ranting, swearing fellow soldier, but a sober, steady, and calm force. Not a warrior king, a man of controlled discipline, measured judgment, and this distinction matters enormously for what was coming. Congress voted unanimously. Washington was appointed commander-in-chief on June 15, 1775. Now, what Washington did next tells you everything about the character of the man, and I think it's worth dwelling on that for a moment. He stood before Congress and said in careful words that he felt great distress from a consciousness that his abilities and military experience may not be equal to the extensive and important trust placed in him. And then, and this line mattered most, he declined any salary. To quote Washington, "No pecuniary consideration could have tempted me to have accepted this arduous employment at the expense of my domestic ease and happiness. I do not wish to make any profit from it. I will keep an exact account of my expenses. Those I doubt not they will discharge, and that is all I desire." He served 8.5 years without pay. And remember this one thing. Benjamin Rush wrote that Washington privately told Patrick Henry he predicted his own failure and ruin from the moment. He took the job anyway. He took it because someone had to. On July 3rd, 1775, Washington arrived at Cambridge to take his formal command. He reviewed the troops, he issued his first general orders. One soldier commented a great deal of grandeur. Another thought it was nothing extraordinary. Both were right, and that tension tells you something about where things stood with Washington. What Washington found was an army in name only. Men from Connecticut answered to Connecticut officers. Massachusetts regiments operated by Massachusetts rules. Virginia riflemen barely acknowledged the other colonies existed. On July 4th of that year, a date that would ring quite differently 1 year later, Washington issued general orders declaring, "The Continental Congress, having now taken the troops of several colonies, They are now the troops of United Provinces of North America, and it is hoped with all distinctions of colonies will be laid aside, so that the same spirit may animate the whole. What Washington also understood from the earliest weeks of his command, something that separates great commanders from merely good ones, is that the ground tells you things no map alone can tell you. He'd been reading terrain since his teenage years as a surveyor in the Virginia wilderness. And by 1778, he would formalize that instinct into the Culper spy ring, an intelligence network that used numerical code, invisible ink, and dead drops on Long Island farms, and a laundry line as a signal system. Washington never learned the true identities of his own agents. The operational security was airtight, even by today's standards. Field intelligence, terrain knowledge, the map before movement, these things have always mattered, and they still do. There is a winter that lives in the American memory as a sacred ordeal, a trial by cold and hunger that either broke men or forged them. This was Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, December 1777 through June 1778. Washington led roughly 11,000 soldiers through the encampment following a string of defeats. Defeated in Brandywine, Germantown, this had left Philadelphia in British hands. The name of Valley Forge came from a forge that stood along the Valley Creek. The British had destroyed it, but it was a fitting symbol. The forge itself had been wrecked. The work of reforging this entity would fall to the men who remained. 1 in 6 soldiers who marched in the valley did not come out. Over 2,000 men died, not primarily from cold, but from typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and starvation. And into this wreck of an army, walked a Prussian officer. On February 23, 1778, he would change everything. Baron Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben arrived as a volunteer, carrying an introduction from Benjamin Franklin that somewhat overstated his credentials. Franklin had described him as a lieutenant general of Frederick the Great, but in actuality, he had a Prussian rank that was closer to captain. What Steuben brought instead of rank was hard-won knowledge of how professional armies are built and maintained. He looked at what he had found and said, no European army could have held it together in such circumstances. And then he got to work. Here's the part that sticks out to me as remarkable. Steuben wrote drill manuals in French every night, staying only days ahead of what he was actually training the soldiers on. Hamilton and John Lawrence translated them into English. But the innovation that genuinely shocked American officers was this. Steuben drilled the men himself. In European armies of the day, it was beneath an officer's dignity to drill common soldiers. Steuben went on to the parade ground at Valley Forge, where he swore fluently in 3 languages, which in my estimation made him deeply popular. And he showed them what a trained soldier looked like. He standardized the bayonet charge, a tactic American soldiers had almost never trusted or used. Within months, Continental soldiers would attack with unloaded muskets and win battles on bayonets alone. At the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in late June 1778, the Continental Army stood its ground against British regulars, and they fought them to a standstill. No rout, no chaos, a disciplined force holding terrain under pressure. Steuben's regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, what he would later call the Blue Book, was formally adopted by Congress in March 1779 and remained the standard training manual of the United States Army until 1814. Now what I'd like you to think about is who actually filled the ranks of this army. At its peak, the Continental Army numbered 230,000 men, over 8 years of conflict. And this is the part we tend to forget. Most of them were farmers, tradesmen, laborers, and apprentices who simply left their fields and their shops and went right to fight. At certain points in the war, nearly 10% of Washington's army consisted of black soldiers, women, wives, and daughters of soldiers, free women, and enslaved women seeking freedom. They followed the army and did indispensable work and kept the force in the field. Historians estimate between 3,000 and 7,000 women served in this capacity. Martha Washington herself wintered with her husband in the field and tended to the sick. Through lack of pay, lack of supplies, near desertion of whole regiments, and the treason of Benedict Arnold, he kept the army together. The army stayed in existence, which meant it remained. And then, when Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown in October of 1781, Washington did something that astonished the whole world. He gave his power back. He returned his commission to Congress. He went home. There had been officers who proposed making him a king. He refused that outright. The principle he had insisted upon from his first day of command was that military authority must remain subordinate to civilian governance. For him, this wasn't negotiable. Not then, not ever. June 14th, 2025 marks the 250th anniversary of the Continental Army's founding. The U.S. Army that descended from that vote in Independence Hall is now the most capable military fighting force the world has ever seen. This isn't an institution built on hereditary aristocracy or conscript compulsion, but on the principle, and I think this matters enormously, that free men and women, when they choose to serve, can be forged into something formidable, and that their service is a choice that must remain tied to something. Remember that the men at Valley Forge were not fighting for a country that existed yet. They were fighting for the idea of one. The map of the nation they were defending was still being drawn. That combination of disciplined service, informed action, knowledge on the ground, and a cause that outlasts any individual, this doesn't have an expiration date. At Spartan Forge, the combination sits at the center of everything we build. We like to consider ourselves born out of these ideas. The tools we design are for people who take the field seriously, who understand that knowing the terrain before you move, preparing your equipment before it matters, and making decisions from information rather than assumptions are not just military virtues. They are the virtues of anyone who takes what they do seriously. 250 years later, the shining city on the hill, it remains.